we go.
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Peter.
So we will call the meeting to order, CD meeting to order. Welcome, everybody. First order of business is the, excuse me, the minutes from October 27th. Hopefully everybody had a chance to read them. If there are any comments or a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
Excellent. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. Minutes pass. Now we get to the main point of the meeting. And Rebecca, can you provide a bit of an intro for the presenters and kind of kick this off for us, or is Bart gonna maybe do that?
Kurt's here to kind of help facilitate the session between both of the presenters that we have. So I might turn it over to Kurt Wisniewski, pardon me.
Excellent. Hi, Kurt.
Who is with
Sounds
the
good.
League of Wisconsin Municipalities.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us, Kurt.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So yes, Rebecca said my name is Kurt Watinsky. I'm Deputy Director of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities. And our association is all the cities in the state and most of the villages. So about 600 municipalities are members of our organization. We had a conference last month. And at this conference, the presentation, or at least a shorter version that you'll hear a shorter version of the presentation that was given last month at our annual conference. And it's about a partnership that the league, our association, has entered into with the Congress for the New Urbanism to prepare a handbook for municipalities in Wisconsin that would provide some guidance on making some tweaks or changes to your zoning code that would enable affordable housing to be developed in your community. So we reached out to the Congress for New Urbanism about a year and a half ago, after we saw a similar guidebook that they had prepared for the Vermont League of Cities, and then another one for the Michigan League of Cities. And we liked it because it was very practical in the sense that the recommendations were incremental, doable changes that a community could take on, and didn't necessarily entail an entire rewrite of your zoning code to enable affordable housing to be built in your neighborhoods, within your community. So we approached them, and they were interested in working with Wisconsin in the same way they did it with Vermont and Michigan. And so we reached out to some other stakeholders in our state, see if they would help fund this effort. And we were able to bring on board some partners, including Aarp Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority, and the Wisconsin Builders Association, and also NAIOP Wisconsin. So all those organizations have come together and helped fund this work that CNU, Congress for New Urbanism, is doing on our behalf. And the end product will be a guidebook that'll be released in probably January, February, and then CNU faculty will do some training around the state that we're going to help organize with them on 3 different locations in late February. Just walk people who are interested in learning more about this guidebook through the process or through some of the recommendations they make. And we are lucky to have with us today one of the faculty members at CNU, who also has a private practice as a consultant, a planning consultant in New Mexico. Her name is Susan Henderson, and she actually spent time with 5 communities in Wisconsin earlier in the fall, and kind of went in depth into their situation and what were, looked at some of the things that were holding them back, or some of the possible challenges that they were facing with their zoning code, or with the other regulations within their community that would hold back the development of affordable housing. So she got a taste of Wisconsin regulatory culture. And then also the second speaker following Susan is Taylor Graybell, who's a assistant planner at the city of Eau Claire. And the city of Eau Claire was one of the communities, the 5 communities that the CNU staff had a deep dive with those 5 communities. And Eau Claire was one of them. And he's going to talk a little bit about, what that experience was like, what they've learned, and maybe some of the changes that they might be thinking about in Eau Claire to make affordable housing more of a reality in their community. So with that, I can turn it over to Susan. Susan, thanks for joining us from New Mexico. So I don't know, is it 8 o'clock there or 7 o'clock or?
Actually, I'm in Winnipeg and it's 9 o'clock.
Oh, okay. All right. I can't keep up with you. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Susan.
Okay, I will share my screen. And can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Yes.
And thank you very much, Kurt, and it's a pleasure to be here. Our firm Placemakers also has done some zoning in Wisconsin in the Madison area. So we are, and I have family there. So anyway, it's been a pleasure to have reasons to be reconnected. But it was really interesting to work with all of the local governments that Kurt organized, including Taylor and Eau Claire, in last fall, because once you understand issues that everyone is facing, it's interesting how very similar they are across municipalities from large to small. So just a moment to talk briefly about the project for code reform, which Kurt began with. It's an effort by the Congress for the New Urbanism to, we've long been practitioners of form-based codes, and that's the bulk of the work that my firm does. But our last executive wanted to make sure that we weren't leaving smaller municipalities behind for all of these reasons. Code changes usually are very expensive if they're done holistically, top to bottom. They can be quite complicated legally and even more so with community buy-in. And it does require time, usually at least a year, sometimes longer, 2 or 3 years it might take. It takes support of your elected officials because it's their constituents that are being affected. And of course, they have a lot at stake in that particular venue. And the reality is nobody really understands the nuance of zoning unless they're a code nerd. And I like to say that I proudly wear that hat. It's interesting to understand as an architect, the way I got into zoning was because of the barriers that it caused in the work that I was attempting to do. And when you look, and then also working in really unique and beautiful places and seeing that their zoning produced, conventional suburban sprawl from anywhere America, then it was destroying the very context that was, some of their biggest economic engine with tourism, et cetera. And so Charleston, South Carolina is an example, and Savannah and Taos, New Mexico, and Pasadena, California. So it's all across the US that we became burdened with these one-size-fits-all zoning ordinances in the mid-20th century. And but for people to understand how pervasive it is and how much it really influences the character of our built environment, that's a big educational piece. And that's usually part of a code overhaul is education. And then that leads to the public buy-in, because as I mentioned with the political will, if your community gets nervous, people don't show up at planning commission meetings or our council meetings unless there's something on the agenda that's freaking them out a little bit. And so when you get that notice in the mail that your property is going to be rezoned, that's when everyone shows up. And usually it's with pitchforks. So it's not a very pleasant experience, as some of you probably have had yourselves. Anyway, so CNU's goal was, what is a way to bypass this and be able to make small incremental changes that can have a large impact and aren't so complicated and expensive. And there was a planning director that was a member of CNU in Nashville, Tennessee. And he came up with this phrase: if you do nothing else, do this. So what are the biggest little things that you can do as a municipality to get your toe in the water? Now, I know y'all are doing some really major work, and you're also considering a form-based code or code rewrite. So this probably doesn't apply to you, but it's the construct for the project for code reform is to leave the smaller, less affluent municipalities behind, not to leave them behind. So in our meetings with the Wisconsin communities, we came up with a series of goals that were issues they all were having. And the very first one was to increase housing availability. Many of the local governments were having a struggle with this, particularly in the pandemic real estate surge. So the big issues that are barriers to availability within your existing housing stock is many of you who have historic communities like y'all do, there are non-conforming lots, because when your zoning codes were written in the 50s, 60s, and even through the 80s, they were written as a standard suburban model frequently, which means that your historic lots were just too small. What got platted in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century isn't in compliance with suburban zoning. And you also have non-conforming densities, because many, like this example of this cute duplex, it's a 1/1, and it's a house form and it fits in perfectly in a neighborhood, but it's a density that is usually not permitted within R1. And then the other issue was parking requirements. And this is not just, I know y'all just went through a major effort with your multifamily, but even with your single family or your, what we call missing middle, that delicate density between 2 and 6, the parking requirements are frequently 2 per unit. And with these older lots, there just isn't space on the lot for 4 spots. And so because zoning followed the historic development, it doesn't reflect what's on the ground. And this is a limitation on really maximizing your existing housing. And another big thing that we heard often, and as Kurt mentioned, one of the stakeholders was AARP, and it is this issue of aging in place. We were recently working in a community right outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and there was a lady who was probably in her early 70s, and she had a large suburban house, and she talked about the need to downsize, and that, it was just too big of a yard, it was too much upkeep, too big of a house. Her husband had passed away. And, but her point was this, she said, home is where my neighbors are. And so the thing that she was struggling with leaving were her neighbors, not the house that was too big for her. And so as we provide an opportunity to age in place, that really should also include aging in place on your own site with the land that you have already invested in with your mortgage. And so the issues that come along with that, once again, are the parking requirements, because if you have an ordinance that permits ADUs, frequently the parking requirements are the same as they are for the primary residence, even though people are living much smaller in an ADU. And here's another tricky thing we discovered in Vermont. I don't know what the practices are here in Wisconsin, but we've seen many ordinances that the owner is required to inhabit the primary residence. Well, as you're downsizing and trying to age in place, if you can move into the smaller unit, get a greater income stream off the large unit, it's a win-win for being size appropriate and also augmenting your retirement income. And then allowing larger units. Frequently, ADUs are extremely constrained in their area. And it's true they should still be constrained, but one thing that we did in Vermont is we restricted the front elevation. So it appeared to be subsidiary to the primary residence, but you could do larger than a 400 square foot unit, which was what they had commonly permitted. So these are all issues that could be tweaked within your existing ordinance. And if you permit ADUs, you're basically doubling your density and you're allowing it to be micromanaged by the person who has the most stake, and that's the owner. And then another issue is market demand. Now, this is a photo from Middleton Hills, which is a early 21st century community in right outside of Madison. And there is, we did see that through all of our discussions with the communities involved, and this is true nationally, there is a market demand for blended density mixed use neighborhoods. And if you don't have zoning in place to enable that, then most of the communities we were looking at were actually utilizing PUDs to achieve this. This is an image from Waukesha. It's a new mixed use building on their main street. And their main street zoning didn't permit mixed use buildings. So, it's something that simple. They were using a PUD for it when the easy fix would be to permit residential in your downtown. Maybe you restrict it to upper levels to keep an active frontage, but just to permit it is a big step. So as I mentioned, blended density is preferred, mixed use is preferred, and PUD ordinances, depending on the area that they're covering, they essentially act like de facto spot zoning because they're writing their own regulations for a particular parcel, which may or may not reflect the character of the area around them. So the best practice in responding to the desire for these types of neighborhoods is to write, y'all are doing a total top-bottom code rewrite, but one thing you may want to do if you have greenfield land left available to look at is to build, it acts like a pre-designed PUD. So you're building all of the characteristics into what a new neighborhood looks like, and people can request that and utilize it on demand, but you have already built the standards where it fits the character of Shorewood.
Sorry to interrupt. Would you mind just clarifying what does PUD stand for?
I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay. Thank you.
it is. It's referring to in most places as planned unit development or a planned development. And it's essentially when a developer wants to do a new master plan that involves, most places will have requirements like, 5-acre minimums. There is usually some sort of criteria, but like we saw in Waukesha, they were using it for, single parcels that were actually quite small, less than 2 acres. So it just depends on what you have on your books. It could be different, from town to town. So the general recommendations that came out of those meetings included a series of things that are relatively easy to accomplish. And you'll see on the upper corner, this says everywhere. So some things are appropriate everywhere and some things are appropriate more in your historic areas because it's a reflection of things that are difficult to achieve in suburban environments. So dimensional requirements, the easy way to say all this is you just need to tweak your ordinance to reflect the area. And a lot of this zoning was done when it was relatively new technology. And essentially a one-size-fits-all standard was applied throughout the local government. And that could have been, like we saw a lot of places in Wisconsin, a 20-foot front setback was sort of standardized, whether it was residential or commercial, whether it was historic or new. 20 or 25 feet became the standard. Whereas historically, if you look at your village, you'll see that there probably are residences that are on setbacks as small as 10 or 12 feet. So just take your non-conforming lot sizes, your lot coverage requirements, your mismatched density requirements, your dimensional requirements like setbacks and building heights, and make those match. And then additionally match your existing parking location requirements, because maybe a municipality gets all of those first points correct, but frequently they don't require the parking behind the building. And if you look historically at your community, you will see that all the garages were on the alleys, the parking on your main street was behind the buildings. That was the way we built our cities and towns and villages 100 years ago, before parking became king. And if the parking continues to be in back, then you're not destroying the character of your place with fields of parking. We've already been through a lot of this. Usually it applies most appropriately in historic neighborhoods because they historically had accessory buildings that work very well as accessory dwelling units. You allow the owner to occupy the unit, you increase the permissible area, and you don't require additional parking. And especially in historic areas, additional parking for an ADU is really so counterintuitive, because you're able to walk to so many of your daily needs already if you're in a compact part of the town, that everyone having an automobile who lives in the residence, it usually is unnecessary. So density is a tricky question, and it usually raises a lot of red flags for communities that get really nervous about density. I will just begin with this statement. If you build your metrics correctly, your setbacks, your lot coverage, your parking requirements, and your building heights, you have essentially built a density, a permittable density. And in that case, adding the extra dwelling units per acre is a redundancy, and it usually is a contradiction. So we actually recommend that you remove the explicit DUA, or dwelling units per acre requirement, and focus on the things that really create the place that you want to be. So you know the setbacks that you like within your village. Walk around, look at places that you all agree upon are the best loved, and then and make your standards match those places. It's really quite simple. And one thing that you will find is adding this, we call it a delicate density, and it's that missing middle housing. So it's from 2 to 6 or 2 to 8. And that's the type of housing that usually can cohabitate very harmoniously with single family residences. This means that you would permit the subdivision of historic homes. This is another way to age in place. If you have a very large historic residence and you can add a stair and rent out the upstairs, then you can stay within your home and gain income from the upstairs unit. And then, so one thing that we are recommending in this report to the League of Municipalities is only have 3 scales of housing. Of housing density. There are so many different densities in most Wisconsin communities that are reflective of lot size, not housing type. So your lowest density should be 1 or 2 units per lot. The middle density is 3 to 6, or in some places 3 to 8 units per lot. And the high density is anything over 6 or 8. And the reason being, it's those big garden apartments or the big multi-story buildings in your centers that make people extremely uncomfortable. So make sure that that is separated from this thing that we call missing middle housing, because that is your sweet spot. That is where you can probably achieve the greatest level of affordability, naturally occurring affordability that isn't even, subsidized. And it's the part that's missing from most zoning ordinances. So the other big takeaway is to know where you are. And I love this image. Oops, I passed it. I love this image because context really matters, whether you're in the center, in your walkable historic area, if you're on the suburban fringes, or if you're in the rural area. All of those should have different standards, both for housing, for affordability, and for zoning. And just the de facto affordability, not, like I said, maybe we should say attainability of housing in the center is always going to be better than on the edge, because of the fact that you can lose a car and make all of those savings. I think the last time I looked it up, AAA said your annual savings of, the cost of owning a car is $10,000 a year when you consider all of the associated costs besides a capital investment. So if you're trying to allocate affordable housing or attainable housing, the center of your village is the best location. So we looked at the timeline of housing and density in the state. And these are actual buildings across different communities that we just modeled. And the interesting thing about this is in the 1900s and early 2000s, Wisconsin communities were regularly producing all of these building types. So starting in the lower left, a single family house, a series of row houses, 4 units in that particular image. Duplexes is the next one. The next one is a 4-plex. And then the large apartment building was 10 units. So the interesting thing about this, you will notice these are all to the same scale. I'm going to show you 3 images, and we are going to lose units over time and use up more land. And we all know what that does to affordability. So by the 1960s, we had actually lost an entire building type, and that was the townhouses. They weren't, builders in Wisconsin weren't producing those at that time. So you had the single family, the duplex, the small apartment building, and the larger apartment building. In this particular situation, we used up 20% more land. No, sorry, 30% more land, and we lost 12 units of housing. And then by the 1990s, we got back the townhouses. You see there in that second image from the left. So we had single family, townhouses, duplexes, and then garden apartments. So this is only one building out of many that existed in this particular development. And so in the course of a century, we went from compact, naturally occurring affordability. And when you know the land cost and the cost of all of those parking spaces, we were losing units and using up, in this particular case, it was 100% more land area than in the first one. So that study helped us as we were looking at the case study communities, because if you look at pre-1940 and look at these aerial images, you'll see, there's lots of units within every block. And because the street grid was small, that you increased walkability and bikeability, and you had, so it was a multimodal environment. It was mixed use. It had neighborhood parks and schools, and it was a place where you could live without multiple automobiles and very affordably on a small lot. And since 1990, these are the current aerials from Google in each of the communities, and you see that I mean, these patterns are ubiquitous across North America. It's not just Wisconsin, but you get into the long loopy streets, the roads are much wider, they're much faster, there are fewer sidewalks, and the housing types are almost all the same. And so you see what it does for land consumption and therefore a loss of affordability and a loss of housing units. So the final recommendations are, first of all, to remove unnecessary regulations. We recommend, as I mentioned before, that density plus bulk standards are redundant. So the most predictable standard to use is setbacks and building height and lot coverage. And then remove the complicated parking standards, because in many communities, it's even the numbers of spaces required in residential is tied to the number of bedrooms. And that gets incredibly complicated for the applicant and for city staff, especially to administer that over time. You see this example from the ULI. We were looking at these old ULI handbooks, and this one from 1968 is saying, look, folks, this is the best way to deliver housing. It is with dwelling units per acre and on we like to call them spaghetti streets, you know, a lot of cul-de-sacs, a lot of dead ends, and really a lot of cost to the municipality in road maintenance and the maintenance of water and sewer pipe. And the next thing that's really important as you begin your code rewrite is to evaluate your processes, because like I mentioned earlier, how often do you have applicants for a planned unit development? If people are needing to write their own standards because your standards aren't working for them, then you know you have something that needs to be fixed. The same is true about a variance. How often is a variance required because your standards aren't working in the current market? And then how long does it take to get a building permit or a site plan approved? Because if your focus is on delivering affordability, time is money for the applicant. And at the end of the day, they can deliver more cost-effective housing if you can help them get through a clear and predictable process faster. And so here's my little takeaway, and then I'll hand it off to Taylor. My three, if you do nothing else, do this, for municipalities in Wisconsin are align your dimensional standards to match the context. And that applies to suburban standards too, because people that live in large lots, single family, are very, very protective about that, and make sure their standards fit where they are. Don't try to apply, and if you are pursuing a form-based code, I would strongly recommend that you don't try to apply the best practices and urban standards to your suburban settings, or you won't get your code passed. Permit ADUs where appropriate, and reduce your parking minimums. I know y'all just did that for your multifamily, and I know it's a tricky topic. I was speaking with one of your trustees at the conference about it, and she had many concerns. And so it has to be locally crafted with, you know, a fair amount of parking study work done. But parking, the very large parking minimums are a huge barrier to providing attainable housing just because of cost of a parking space. So with that, I will hand it off to Taylor. Unless, maybe we should take questions now while it's fresh in your mind. No?
Well, Susan, this is Peter Hammond. I am not a zoning person at all. So a number of the terms you were using, I appreciated Jessica's question on that. So, and is what you're saying that, again, these changes could be done within a community's existing structure. And so your point is much easier to implement.
Right.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I mean, you could do it. You can notify for a text amendment, you know, much more affordably and quickly. and make those incrementally. So you do one this month and one next month, and, in a very expeditious fashion, you can get to an improved environment for delivering affordable housing.
Yep. And then just a question. So obviously the group sort of went through this identifying best practice, if you will. That was sounded like the point. As you went through that, are there communities out there that already sort of represented some of those best practices that you looked to and saw sort of the accomplishment of all the things you're looking at, and they're able to maintain that organic affordable housing and those kinds of things?
Well, that's why Taylor's speaking next. He will talk to you about that. I would say Eau Claire is probably further along that path than most other communities.
Great. Sorry, Jessica, go ahead.
I think Anne had her
Oh, okay.
hand raised before me, but so I can go after her. That's fine.
Okay, go ahead, Ann.
Well, you're technically a member, Jessica, but I will just say quickly, Susan, you just mentioned the two naughty words, urban and suburban. So I will just tell you our difficulty is that we have an urban use, and we are technically a suburb, but we are not developed, or we were not planned to be a suburb in sort of like the kind of the current notion of a suburb. And so that's, if you can speak to that, that would be very helpful, because that's where we get stuck moving forward.
Yeah. So that's a great point, because many historic villages are like that, in that they're very compact. They had mixed use and blended density historically, although they were built independently and on the fringes of a metro area. So because you do have to drive to more things because of your location in the region. So cultural things, large shopping stuff, usually major recreational events like ball teams and things like that, you absolutely will have to commute to. And a large percentage of your population probably also have to commute to jobs. And with all of that in mind, you have this delicate dance of writing regulations that fit your character, because you don't want to lose that. That is valuable. That's incredibly valuable. So you have to write regulations that fit that, while also acknowledging that you are not independent of automobiles. And so, parking is going to be one of your biggest problems over this entire code update. I would say wherever you fall on here's what we usually start with most clients, and it doesn't end up there. We start with the recommendation that parking is already tightly regulated by both the market and the financiers, because banks won't subsidize a large project if it doesn't have enough parking, whether it's commercial or residential, to meet what the bank anticipates as being successful for the property. So historically, if you go back and read the origins of parking regulations in the 60s, that was like throwing darts at the wall. Nobody really knew anything about how many parking spaces you needed per square feet or per dwelling unit. It was just a bunch of planners sitting around and picking numbers. So the numbers that are in your ordinance are not sacred. Just realize that. And if you have the resources to do a parking study prior to adopting your new code, that is probably the best practice, because you're in a unique situation. You will have a greater parking demand than downtown Milwaukee. But, there's also the possibility that you allow the market and the banks to take care of it, because they will. your developers that come to town and intend to hold the properties, they will not build something that they can't keep leased. They won't build a commercial building without the number of parking spaces that particular retailer or office or restaurant needs. And they will not build an apartment building without the number of spaces that it takes to keep it rented. So I know that sounds like heresy, and it's probably, one of the naughty words. Parking always is. And it will be one of your biggest battles as you go through your zoning update. But I think because of your suburban location, but your urban format, having a parking study is probably critical to your success.
That's great. We did one last year, so we're all good.
There you are.
All right. I'll hand it over to Jessica. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the accessory unit dwellings. That's something we currently don't have in our code, and I think could be beneficial. I'm just wondering how one of the things that's very important in our community to a lot of residents is the charm, and how do you sort of maintain that charm without just like slapping an extra staircase on the outside of your home. Yeah. But I do think that there's a demand in our community for that option. As people age in place, and as young families may have, children at home and have, aging parents too.
Yeah.
I'm just curious your thoughts.
No, that also can be tricky. People get a little nervous about it, so be aware that it could be a communications issue, an educational issue. We went through writing a specific ADU ordinance for Decatur, Georgia, which is a charming town just east of Atlanta. And they had a lot of concerns. I don't want something huge towering over my backyard, so it was heights and sight lines and setbacks, and all of those things have to be carefully considered. The one thing we did in Vermont, which is in that handbook that you can download from the CNU website, is we wrote facade requirements. So if you're permitting densification within your existing neighborhood fabric, it's important if it's new build, so to get it right. The one thing you could do to simplify it and expedite it is say, if it's an existing building, it can be inhabited with an additional unit. So basically, if you have an old carriage house with a space above the garage, you could permit that to become an ADU. If you are adding an upstairs unit, you can require that new stairs go on the rear facade. There are a lot of things you can do to make sure that it's not visually detrimental, because, protecting the charm is protecting your land value, and that's crucial.
Thank you.
Susan, just quickly, just on something you had mentioned in your response to and just on the parking, to make sure I understand, you were saying certainly there's the code requirement for parking, but again, that is, as you said, not sacred, which is a really great point. And what I heard you say was that the market, the market really does define it, because again, a developer, it's not like they're getting away with anything by playing with parking, or there is a valid argument there to be had that they understand, they know the parking they need to make the building work, and we should, while we maybe don't completely rely on that, we can't disregard that as if they're, that they're trying to get away with something, because that won't serve them well in the long term. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, it's not economically valuable to them to, diminish the parking if they actually need it.
Yeah.
And like, for example, in some places there are parking maximums because developers generally want more parking. And reducing or eliminating your minimums doesn't mean parking's not going to get built. It will be built because the market demands it.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Certainly. Well, Taylor, I will hand it off to you.
Okay, can everyone see everything? Cool.
Yes.
Oh, I have the wrong date on here, but yes. So my name's Taylor Grable. I'm an associate planner with the City of Eau Claire, a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and in California, like my internship, I did a fair amount of housing work, and then in Oregon, working on implementing a lot of new code about creating clear and objective standards for housing development, for multifamily housing, adopting new ADU code, reducing like the size of ADUs and allowing 2 on a lot, changes in parking requirement. And then I came over about a year ago to the City of Eau Claire, where I started working as well, on housing, like a housing fund, and then some code changes too. So here's the agenda. I'll go pretty, do we need to be done at 10 o'clock?
Some people may need to drop off, Taylor, but no, we don't really have a hard end. We'd much rather hear the information, and we're very flexible on timing here. These
Okay.
meetings tend to run long, but again, this is all great information, so don't worry about that.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to schedule. So here's the agenda. We'll go into each part moving forward, but I just wanted to give you guys a little heads up about what's coming next. So I have to do a sales pitch for the city. It's really cool if you haven't visited before. 2020, we got a lot of recognition. It's a great place to come visit. Great, it's walkable. We have really cool bridges and a nice old town downtown. We also have some really cool historic neighborhoods that I think are a good example of some of the proposed code changes, if you ever would like to see that. So here's some general information about our city. These are some stats that help with understanding like housing and code. And I'm not sure if you've been presented with all of it before, but one thing is just knowing the total size of the community. We have about 68,000 people. We're 85% white, only one race. You can see our household income. The average is around 69,000. The median is 55,000. And household just means the number of people that are living in like a unit. So that could be one person, or it could be 10. The median age is 31.5, which is pretty low. And there are major industries. And on the right, you could see our age cohorts. So that means these are like 5-year categories for different ages. And you'll see from 20 to 24, we have a really big amount. And that's because we have 2 colleges in our community, UWEC, and then the community or Chippewa Valley Technical College. And this like town gown issue where like the students versus maybe the residents who chose to buy a house near a school could sometimes cause problems. So a little bit about the housing cost burden. A household is considered burdened if it's paying more than 30% of its gross income to housing costs. So this could be like rent or mortgages, utilities, HOA fees, etc. And a note about this 30% number. This was made back in the 1980s in New York. It's another case of, oh, here's this number we made up, and now everywhere in the country should have it applied. This number doesn't really reflect the amount of transportation cost. It doesn't reflect changes to like student loans or healthcare. So while this 30% is sort of a standard, I have seen communities that actually adopted a lower number, like 23%, when the city was defining its own definition of burden and what's affordable to a member of the community. On the right-hand side, you can see 45% of our renters are burdened, while only 16% of homeowners are burdened. So when we're thinking about affordability of housing, we could see that those who rent are in a higher need of housing than those who own homes. And again, all these numbers I think are important for you to understand the needs in your community and like tools that could be adopted to address those needs. So here's the example of the residential structure makeup. So this is showing the number of occupied housing units by type. So that big blue one, a single family detached, there's 15,000 units that are that type. You'll see that the gold, the brownish one at the bottom, there's 2,000 units that are in a single family attached. The gray is showing that in a duplex or two apartments that are attached to each other on a lot, there's about 2,200 units and so on. It's interesting to note, if you look on the very right hand side, about 65% of the current buildings or current occupied residential structures are a single family of some sort. And as Susan was talking about, this number has likely shifted more and more towards these single family units. Historically, there was, and when we look at some of the neighborhoods in our community, this number was far lower. So we see this pretty radical departure from what was historically developed in our community. So the city filled out an assessment form that was provided by the Congress of New Urbanism to identify common barriers to like fair housing access, affordability, walkability, and town vitality. We presented this following slides to the CNU, which were the results of our assessment. So broadly, we had 7 categories that were issues to achieving those previously mentioned goals. And I'll go into each one for us moving forward. So we're not seeing mixed use compact development per our main growth strategy. So there was actually something called traditional neighborhood development, which was adopted by the state legislature of Wisconsin, that created much of like what we've been talking about earlier today, especially with different development types and mixing in commercial. I'm not sure if it's even been done anywhere in the state because I'm pretty new here, but that's a interesting code option that it has many barriers due to its size. It like requires 10 acres, and I'm not really sure if that's even possible in your community, but it's definitely something to look at. And I believe it should be in your code now, but I'm not 100% sure about the legislative requirements. But again, traditional neighborhood development, TND. So here's an example of a recent subdivision in our community. It's about 55 acres in size. The proposed uses are single family and attached single family, about 163 units for a dwelling units per acre of 2.9, which is really small. It doesn't meet the requirements that we detailed in our comprehensive plan. And our comprehensive plan tells us about over the next 20 years, here's the sort of development we should have to meet the goals in our community. So really what we should see moving forward needs to be meeting that comprehensive plan to meet our overall goals. You'll also notice long blocks with no pedestrian ways. So these are street B to street C is like, it's like a couple thousand, 2,000 feet. And it really calls into question, like, how can a child who lives on lot 81 has to make its way to his friend's house that's on block 109, on 109 or down to 152. You have to cross lots of streets, and it really makes it so that people don't want to walk anymore, and we become more dependent on cars. And one solution of this could be putting in like pedestrian ways or something. That could be a code update that allows for people to at least walk from one street to street. But here you see the lot development pattern that Susan showed earlier. That's kind of a radical departure from the block grid that we've seen throughout most of our history of development in our city. This project removed wetlands and other tree groves that people liked. And again, we see this development that's not dense, that's very car oriented, that's on the outside of our community, that just creates a need for more cars and removes more of the natural lands. And then they also sought a planned unit development to reduce the front yard setbacks. And this is something we see on a lot of projects in our communities. Our front yard setbacks like 30 feet, and a lot of developers are seeking a reduced setback from that. So it's a case where we see kind of the market asking for one thing, but then they have to do kind of a spot zoning to actually get it. So again, that's a part we're working with staff, seeing like, yeah, what have developers been requesting as part of planned unit developments or as part of variances? So we also have a history of downzoning in city core neighborhoods. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'll try to make it understandable. In 2015, in one of our core neighborhoods in our city, that's sort of like maybe a classic Eau Claire, a walkable, nice area, we took a lot of lots that were zoned as R3 or R4 and reduced their zoning to RMP, which is RM planned unit development, or to R2. Now, what does this mean? First, we could think about the changes of uses that occurred. So the R3 and R4 zones, it permits all residential development types, but just because a residential development type is permitted, that doesn't mean that it could actually be built when all the when all the design and dimensional standards come into play. So here's a case like where, okay, yeah, 100 units could be permitted on the small lot, but when you have your parking requirements come in, your maximum amount of lot coverage of structure, your height requirements, your setback requirements, it'll really only lead to 1 or 2 units being able to be built at most. So back to the uses, the R2 zone, which are those orange ones, makes it so that you have to go before the plan commission to convert a single family to a 2-family. So once that would have never been required, it would have just been a building permit. But now you have to go before your plan commission, have it be publicly notified. That'll add probably 45 days at least. And it'll open up for your neighbors to be able to comment on a project that historically would have been permitted until 2015. So in this case, that was probably like almost 100 years it would have been permitted. It does permit the building of new 2-family, and 3 or more units are not permitted, even if they were before. And again, the RMP is a little higher of a zone, so that permits up to 9 units. But again, when the design and dimensional standards come into play, that parking requirement, that maximum lot percent coverage, setbacks, that doesn't mean that 9 units could actually be placed. And then a conditional use permit would be required for 9 units or more. And this would be, again, something that needs to go before the plan commission. And a note, I'm not sure how much you all have to deal with this, but recent legislature by the state of Wisconsin really changed the conditional use permits from something very broad to now it's permitted with conditions. And just that tool has changed. in Wisconsin. So that's something to think about as well. So then on that right-hand side are those dimensional and design standards we're talking about. There's more lot area per unit required, greater rear yard setbacks, more lot coverage of structures, or less lot coverage of structures is permitted. Less amount of improved surface area is permitted. So that's areas where cars park. So not only, so now parking is even more limited by the amount of land that could be paved. So even if a neighbor's property had 80% paving of their space, that means that you couldn't do that now, even if it has existed for like 100 years. And then lower maximum building height comes into play in both of them as well. So you might have one neighbor who has a 40-foot building, but this new one could only build a 24. And this is something that's seen throughout the country. And it'd be interesting to see if it was in your community. So historically, there's been a lack of acceptance on density, both infield, greenfield, and missing middle housing. So we worked recently with a neighborhood association, and there was a very close vote about looking at permitting additional missing middle housing types. It's very interesting because the right-hand side are actual pictures from our community, duplex, fourplex, courtyard, apartment building. So these are things that are existing, but some people were nervous about it. And it's an interesting case here where it was primarily all homeowners that were part of this process and were voting. But as we previously saw, 45% of the renters are the ones that are rent burdened, while only 16% of homeowners are. And there's sort of just that conflict there. But yeah, you'll see in existing communities, many of these nice structures that are a great example of what it means to have a duplex or a quad or an apartment building.
So Taylor, just curious, so just when you said lack of acceptance, I'm just curious, what were you hearing from the community as, what were their primary, was it the usual things, or did you hear anything sort of unique about the concerns with respect to this?
I think it was primarily about renters, which I would say one thing that's interesting is that we have more there's more racial segregation now in the US than there was in the 1960s. And that might be part of just due to how renters are sort of being segregated to certain parts of the community through zoning.
So it was, yeah, so as you said, that your community is largely, as you said, single family home, and so this was going to increase renters and just the philosophical or perceived differences that might create, though they're wrong, but people's perceptions of what might happen. That was your sense of kind of what was driving some of the concerns.
Yeah, and
okay,
to make clear, I don't mean that they were racially concerned, just that that's like the functional outcome. But yeah, it just relates back to, this was near the college. So these people chose to purchase a home near a college, but then they're feeling the conflict with college students that live near there. So I think a concern was that that there'd be just different housing types brought. And I think one thing was just continuing education about like the housing structures that we're looking at will be very similar to the ones that are existing. And some people just didn't get that still. Well, they still didn't really get that, like, it's not going to be looming over your house. It'll look just similar to your house, you know, but that was a point that was difficult to get across for some folks. But I think as time goes and more conversations happen, people will get that more. And I think that there's been a change in, even in that neighborhood, in kind of like the understanding of what that means. But it could be confusing and scary, definitely, especially I think if your retirement is in a house and it's like your whole life is there, you know?
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, I don't really blame anyone, but that's where I think education could help.
Thank you.
Okay, outdated dimensional standards. So here was an interesting example that I had. I was having a phone call with someone, and this is an existing lot. It's zoned R2. It's actually about 5,900 feet in size. The unit as it exists, there's like, it's a triplex with one very large bedroom, and they wanted to split the bedroom in half, but basically what that meant is when they add that additional bedroom, they would need more parking spaces. So it made it impossible to take this existing like structure that's been used this way for probably 80 years, with neighboring homes having more than single family, and they couldn't place it. Another very important point, the lot area of this lot is less than 5,000 square feet. And if you look over under number 1 lot area, you go over to R2. A new R2 lot has to be at least 6,000 square feet to place a single unit. If you go down to the next one, lot area 2-family dwelling unit, to be able to place a 2-family, the lot area needs to be at least 10,000. So again, this one's not even 6,000. Number 3, a lot area for a 3 or 4-family dwelling unit, not NA, you can't even place one. So here's an example of a lot that's very small, according to our current standards at least. It has existed there for about, this one was about 70 years or 80 years. It seemed to have worked, but it wouldn't be allowed today. And then another continuation, I've highlighted all these lots on this block that are non-conforming in some way. So this is a block in an area of our town that's very walkable. It has naturally occurring affordable housing. So that means housing that's maybe around that 30% for the median income household. And a lot of people like to live there. And it's been there for about like 80 years. But yeah, most of them wouldn't be able to be built today. Either they're too thin. You could see number 5 lot width. This is an R1 zone, so it needs to be at least 60 feet. Front yard setback is 30 feet. Many of these are within 30 feet of the front yard. Rear yard setback of 25 feet. So the primary structure needs to be 25 feet back from the side, from the alleyway, and some of those aren't. The side yard, we won't get into that, but some of them violate the side yard setback rules. Maximum percent lot coverage, 30% at max. You could tell that some of those buildings are larger than that. The building height, they all meet that relatively. The building heights fine are usually fine, but this is just another case of going and walking around older parts of your community thinking, is this a nice part of our community? And then looking at a map and working and seeing, oh, how many of these are non-conforming, and what can we do to bring them, and do we want to adopt new rules to bring them to standard? So here's some parking requirements. I won't go into all of them. The main part is if you look at all of these garages, they access in the alleyway, but nowadays we make it so that your garage door entrance has to be at least 15 feet back from an alleyway. So most of them are non-conforming. They wouldn't be allowed now. And then they also cover too much of the rear area. There's a maximum percent coverage of our rear yards. So the vast majority of these garages wouldn't be permitted today, even though it's been operating this way for probably 80 years in this area. Administrative review. The Plan Commission has a lot of oversight, even on smaller projects. So they're required to review a lot, and they'll have meetings that are 2 to 3 hours long every 2 weeks. So they're really focused on doing current planning review, and it could be difficult to get into other sort of code revision. And there's cases where there's clear standards that could be met, like these yes or no questions that really staff could handle after the community comes together and decides through these code changes what's important. Like if a certain height's important, set it to that and it's a yes or no. But we have a lot go before our Plan Commission that could maybe be created into more clear standards, and then they'd be able to address other issues. So the Congress of New Urbanism made a set of recommendations. So aligning the zoning districts with existing physical patterns. I think we showed examples of that earlier, adjusting setbacks, heights, and parking locations. Just looking at older parts of our community, there are examples, adding building types which reflect actual buildings in each neighborhood. So that could be expanding the use categories like was recommended. And then adjust lot standards like coverage. Again, looking at some of the historic areas in our town. And then recommended no ADU parking requirements, and then to encourage like off-street parking and to do shared parking in the mixed use areas. So shared parking, we actually require the Plan Commission to review it through a conditional use permit. And really it's like if the applicant is able to show that they have enough parking on that lot to share it, does it really need to go before the Plan Commission? And then, as I was talking about, administrative review, and then continue the public education recommendations. I think there's been a shift, but yeah, I mean, people have a lot riding on their property, and it could be very nerve-wracking change. So our next steps, we created a newly formed Housing Opportunities Commission, and we're working with them right now on housing policies. Using the CNU recommendations and then some of our own. We're starting now to prioritize, like I believe you all have some code changes, and we're working our way through that. We just finalized a new affordable housing fund, $300,000, and we granted the money to a winner. That's to a winning project that's providing about 50 units of affordable housing. So we're really excited about that. And then we're continuing to work on implementing that code reform. Obstacles are the education, limited time, and limited like staff time. Some of these are pretty big projects, and it could be difficult to address them all while still working on our other responsibilities as staff. And then we're also looking to integrate some of these recommendations into an upcoming neighborhood plan that we're working on. So again, that's getting at the front end of some of this education. And we're really trying to overlay that historic district. And it's like, if this is what you like about your community or your neighborhood, how can we seek to continue development to make it keep its character? Thank you. And then does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Taylor, this is Peter. I'll start it off. I don't see any hands raised right now, but I might not see everybody. Just curious on the education part, and we can maybe take this offline or follow up, but that's obviously something we've been thinking about just overall in terms of affordable housing and educating. And I think the way we're thinking about it is to keep going back to the community's objectives and goals and desires. And, while you might get into the weeds of a certain conversation, trying to bring people back to what is it that we're trying to accomplish and what is the community that we want to have. I'm just curious, as your groups have approached education, how have you thought about that, or what do you, from your perspective, what has worked well that has gotten people to kind of see the opportunity? So I'll just leave it at that and get your thoughts on that.
I've seen in other communities using blocks, like if you're having a physical meeting with people, having like actual blocks and putting them next to each other on a street and using that to show the form of structures and to help people. This is if you're having like in-person meetings, because you could put like, here's a single family, here's a duplex. You don't really indicate anything on them, but you just put them next to each other, and it could help people understand what the form of a structure looks like. What we're also, so we have those images as well that we're working on, and then what I've started to take, and San Francisco had some really good examples of this. You take existing structures and you put in these like red dotted lines with the new, with like that down zone we did. You would put the red dotted lines and it would show like what's permitted there now versus what was originally there. Or you could put that over an existing structure. So I think I've seen really good examples of, you take like, you either provide people physical items, which is really helpful, or you take pictures existing within your neighborhood and you could red dot it to be like, here's what we're proposing. Or, I mean, it's even better if you could be like, here's a tiny single family home, or here's a single family home. The next street, like house over, you take that red dot and you transpose it over. I've seen that really successful as a means of like showing the form.
Thank you. Mike, you have a question?
Sure, Taylor, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, describe the project that you are just about to undertake on your affordable housing initiative.
Oh, we just finalized it up, and we had $300,000 through capital improvement plan money, and we created an RFP, which I could send over if it'd be helpful. And with the RFP, we tried to create these clear standards that there was no like, the applicant claimed a certain number of points and then we just checked it. So we had to do very little work, and it created a pretty, I think, objective set of criteria. But yeah, so the applicant already received some LIHTC funding from the state to help build affordable housing, but we helped like finalize it for about $8,888 a unit, which I think is like a really great investment. And I just know Oregon better. There was a study that showed like 1.5 units were created per LIHTC unit, or sorry, 1.5 jobs were created per LIHTC unit. So, I mean, theoretically, we created a job for about 1.5 jobs for about $9,000 each. So that was really exciting.
Great.
So is it a large, is the plan a larger structure? I'm just curious where it's located, just sort of getting back to Susan's thought of, this ideally happening within the sort of the central part of the community.
Yeah, so this is it's like a 60 unit development that has some market rate, and then the rest are like below, then 50 of them are below 50% AMI. So that's for like people who work full time but might be in a service job or something like that. And it's probably about a mile from our downtown. It's pretty close to the downtown. It's but it's sort of, it's in a zone that was just an area that was historically industrial, but now it's been developing with more like higher density development. So it's not right next to single family homes, but those are about maybe 2 blocks over with kind of this like dense to less dense to the single family.
So it's a mixed development in terms of the income of the residents,
Right.
probably similar to the Light Horse project maybe in Shorewood.
A lot of the, I'm not sure, but a lot of the projects through WIDA, like the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority, have mixed income in it.
Good, thank you.
So Taylor, I guess one other question, I don't know how much you know about Shorewood, obviously, but we're land constrained. I just think about Eau Claire, it seems like, obviously you have, you showed that subdivision, we don't have land for that, but I'm curious that I would think to some degree that adds a level of complexity to your overall, because you have sort of a wider variety of things that might be happening. And so with respect to code and planning and all that, there are differences, I guess, between sort of that newer out of the town development and the central. As you think about the sort of the central and the densest part, this work that you've been doing, what in there do you think has really been impactful or will be impactful to maintain the affordability, again, within the, what I'll call maybe the older part or the central core of Eau Claire?
So in the kind of the more central parts, we've actually been seeing some development pressure about a lot of these structures here are like 100 years old, or I live in a structure that was built in 1840 in the downtown. So we see in our like downtown area, a lot of these like buildings are like 100 years old or more, and they're starting to need to be demolished. Some of them just don't have that much like historic value, and they're just buildings eventually are demolished.
Yeah.
And so we're actually seeing kind of multifamily development coming in, but it's a larger multifamily, probably plus 10 units. So we're in this interesting place where we have pretty big development happening.
And sorry, Taylor, what are they replacing? Like that big, what is it taking place of?
Like, so more that the density or the delicate density missing middle. So it's taking like duplexes to quads, which are in our like older neighborhoods, which kind of just look like big single family maybe. And it's replacing them with largely bigger structures. And to get into the weeds, partially it's that people are being able to purchase neighboring lots and then remove lot lines to build these bigger structures. But yeah, we're in this case where it's like about 70% of our land that's residential is zoned R1. So that's all going to be like, right now that's all single family. And then our inner areas, we're seeing sort of some larger development coming in. So we have this real missing middle gap issue where, so that's something that we're looking at more. And it's one of our larger parts, because you could get a pretty dense development, but then also it's not like that big. And maybe I prefer to live in a neighborhood like this in an apartment complex. So it's this kind of weird point about like, we have a lot of single family zone that only allows single family, and we don't really have this good in between right now.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Susan.
So in response to that, and this is it's a conundrum, but I will say, based on a comment earlier about charm and, the character of your place, and I think about what I've observed digitally of Eau Claire, and I completely concur with Taylor's point about if you allow lot consolidations, and that's in your zoning, so you can permit it or prohibit it, you're going to get bigger buildings. And the question for you as people who are pursuing affordability, at what, you know, at what cost. And if you get enough of those really big apartment complexes, your community is going to, you know, react very negatively. And so it's a delicate dance between achieving more units that are more attainable with retaining your historic ambiance. And, you know, one easy fix for that is to prohibit consolidations. If you, I mean, that's like a one-line edit that, you know, is one way around it.
I would also say we downzoned a lot of our downtown, so you can't even rebuild the 2-unit or the 3-unit anymore. So it's stuck in this position of these lots kind of cost a lot with existing structures on it. So are you going to like demolish it and try to build a single family, or will you try to consolidate and place more units? So there's like market forces at play. But part of it is you can't replace existing structures. So yeah, it's like this catch-22 or something. So I would say, like, if you want to continue the historic neighborhood, it needs to have the same zoning, or it needs to be able to permit the existing structures. Otherwise, they'll all like become what's permitted, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, Susan or Taylor, I'm curious, sort of, Susan, on your comment about, you know, prohibiting the lot consolidation, you know, so, and others can jump in, you know, our opportunity obviously is that, you know, in terms of affordability, so we did the study and we are lacking in affordable units for people. And so, you know, as you think about that, part of, so do we need to create more units? And to do that, do you need to have some bigger structures that can house more people? You know, how do we create the affordability within sort of the existing structures that we have?
One easy way to double your density, I mean, it doesn't guarantee the level of affordability, but you double your availability by permitting ADUs.
Right, yes, clearly
So
that's it, yeah.
that's like a no-brainer.
It is,
And
yeah.
it's done at a scale that doesn't freak people out.
Yep, absolutely.
And it doesn't impact your, you know, your aesthetics. The second thing is, like Taylor was mentioning, if you, do you permit residential above retail downtown now?
Yes.
You do. So if you maintain your parcel size downtown and find a way to incentivize through your affordable housing programs, the development there above, you know, in existing buildings. First of all, that doesn't change the aesthetics in any way, because I think it's a tragedy they're tearing down buildings in Eau Claire, historic buildings, because I mean, if we're talking about climate change and, you know, sustainability, then when you look at the embodied energy in those buildings and what it takes to replace them, you know, it's huge. So anything you can do to, in a villager age, anything you can do to incentivize adaptive reuse with additional residential, I think would be in your best interest, because it doesn't impact your character or your aesthetics, but you have to incentivize it, you know, because the easy thing for a developer to do is to scrape it and replace it.
Yeah.
I would say, I don't know, Susan, do you remember what the density numbers were for like the 18-year earlier graphs? Did you have that?
Yeah, it was like the total calculation of units per acre was 36.
Yeah, so it's probably, I've looked at some places in our downtown core, and it's probably like 20 to 30 units per acre of just like single family to quads.
Right.
But like I showed you guys, that 55 acres we developed, what was it? It was like 2.3 dwelling units per acre. So I think Japan's or Tokyo's interesting too. It's like one of the biggest cities in the world, but everything's like 3 stories high, basically. You could get a lot of units at 2 stories high, and not need these like 80-unit apartment complexes.
I apologize, but I'm going to have to run. I'm
Okay.
late for my next one. So
Well, Susan, let me just quickly say, so much appreciate the information. We've been having a lot of these education sessions and I feel like I catch up and then we have this one and I feel like I'm holding on by my fingertips so it's a good thing we're recording these because I watched them multiple times. So thank you so much. And Taylor, really appreciate you coming in and providing your insights on Eau Claire. And again, this is, talk about the village, it takes a village, it takes multiple villages to get this done. So again, we can't thank you enough for helping us out in this project.
my pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure too. And I have to also head to another meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much, Kurt.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I could send over that RFP if that's helpful. I don't know. But
Yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to take a look at that. And Taylor, obviously Eau Claire's been doing some work. And so I know we'll sort of stay in touch and see how, I'm always interested in, anybody that's a little ahead of where I am and anything just to learn lessons from them. So, I'm hopeful we can stay in touch and keep talking about what things are going on. So thanks again for joining us.
yeah, no problem. I'd like that. I'm learning about Wisconsin more, and there's different like culture of planning in every state. But
Yeah. And just one other thing, I think, for future conversation, just the student element of Eau Claire. So Shorewood, while small, we do have, we have a UWM, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee is in the city just outside the southern border of our town. And so it does impact housing around there. And so that's something we factor in. And again, I feel like you might have similar dynamics at play there. So it'd be interesting to talk about that at some point as well.
yeah, that's where apartment complexes might work better. But yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, absolutely is. Well, thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, have a nice day.
You too. Okay. Rebecca, Bart, thank you so much for setting that up. I think that was really, really helpful.
More and more, there is the issue for Shorewood. We have these beautiful old apartment buildings that are not as accessible as new construction. And to me, that's just a key that we need to see what we can do without tearing them down, for heaven's sake. So I don't know. I didn't hear the answer with what Eau Claire is doing, but
And Mike, when you say accessible, do you mean from an affordability perspective in particular?
no, not necessarily affordability, because I hear that the rents are low. It's more the stairs
Yeah.
and the
Physical infrastructure.
yeah, just the physical, right. So, and there's so many, and they're really gorgeous on the outside, but
Yep.
I just.
And they're the character. That's the
They
character that we're
are, they
talking about.
definitely are. And it's, it's very unique and we don't want to lose it, but we aren't maximizing their availability to our city, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Rebecca, were you going to mention something? Did I cut you off?
No, I was just gonna say that I think we lost our quorum.
I was just wondering about that as well.
Whoops.
Which is not a
Okay.
big, which is not a big deal, but even though we,
I think Kathy's on the phone. I think that's her phone number down there.
She 5513.
oh, okay, oh, great, thanks Barb for pointing that
Yeah,
out.
I noticed that too, so I think she's still there.
Okay,
Excellent.
Well, should I move adjournment?
Well, do we have, again, Rebecca or Bart, again, the next steps, is there anything specific you wanted to bring up there, or so far, I think this has been amazing. All of this that you've put together has really been helpful, and I think having it recorded and for posterity's sake is just hugely important in this process.
So we'll look forward to bringing you one more session in January, and then we'll also following that be looking forward to taking some next steps for a decision-making process for how we proceed next.
Yep.
So have a wonderful December, everybody.
Yes, you as well. Thanks, everybody, for joining the call.
Yes, thank you.
All right, now we'll take your motion, Lynn.
Okay, I so move.
Do I have a second for adjournment?
Second.
Thank you, Arthur. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Excellent. Thanks again, everybody. We'll talk soon.
Have a good one,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks for joining, Charlie.